The air inside the Tower of London was so heavy with dread that even seasoned guards looked away. It was May 19, 1536, and Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, crowned with splendor just 3 years before, was about to kneel on a scaffold built for her destruction. She would be the first queen in English history to be executed. But what most history books gloss over is this: Anne's death was not simply about removing a wife who no longer pleased the king. It was a carefully engineered act of psychological warfare that would scar her daughter, Elizabeth, for a lifetime and warp England's sense of justice for generations. To understand the horror, you must go back 17 days. May 2, 1536. Anne Boleyn sits in the royal box at Greenwich Palace, watching a joust. She drops her handkerchief, an innocent gesture of courtly favor. Henry VIII, her husband, storms out in rage. Within 24 hours, the Queen of England is dragged away, accused of adultery, incest, and high treason. The charges are not just implausible, they are grotesque. And here's the chilling truth: Henry had already signed her death warrant before the investigation even began. The machinery of her destruction was put into motion by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's ruthless chief minister. He built a case so vile that even Anne's worst enemies doubted it. 5 men were accused of sleeping with her, one of them her own brother, George Boleyn. Think about that for a moment. The Queen was branded with incest, not because anyone believed it, but because nothing short of that would guarantee her execution. The evidence. A court musician, Mark Smeaton, whose confession was ripped from him after being tortured on the rack for 24 straight hours. The other 4 men maintained their innocence until the blade took them. The timeline Cromwell produced was laughable, and was accused of adultery in Greenwich on a day royal records proved she was miles away at Richmond. The lies weren't even crafted to be convincing. Why should they be? The verdict had already been written. Even Eustace Shopweis, the imperial ambassador who loathed Anne, admitted to Emperor Charles V that the case rested on presumption and empty proof. When your sworn enemy says you're being framed, you know the truth no longer matters. And here's where you and I need to pause. If this is already revealing a darker side of Tudor England you've never heard before, take a second to hit that subscribe button. Because what you're hearing right now is only the beginning. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to uncover the systematic torture that turned a queen into a broken shadow before the sword ever touched her neck. Because the real horror of Anne Boleyn's fall wasn't her execution. It was how they dismantled her soul in the days leading up to it. When Anne Boleyn was taken to the Tower of London, most would expect she'd be thrown into a dungeon, left to rot in the cold. But that wasn't Henry's plan. That would have been too merciful. Instead, they devised something infinitely crueler. Sir William Kingston, the Tower's constable, recorded the moment she arrived, and asked him, "Shall I go into a dungeon?" His reply, "No, madam. You shall go into the very same chambers you stayed in during your coronation." Think about that. She was locked not in filth, but in splendor, the same rooms where she once prepared to be crowned Queen of England. The same tapestries, the same furniture, the same view over the Thames. Except this time, those walls weren't a promise of glory. They were the waiting room of her death. That is psychological warfare in its purest form. Kingston wrote that upon hearing this, and burst into laughter, a sharp, unnatural laugh that echoed through the corridors. She laughed again and again in the following days, the kind of laughter that comes not from joy but from a mind beginning to break. And it wasn't just isolation. Henry's ministers ensured every word and spoke was recorded. Her 4 ladies-in-waiting were not friends but spies, planted to observe, report, and feed her despair. Among them was Lady Kingston, the constable's wife. Anne's prayers, her dreams, her hysterical laughter, even her desperate attempts to reason with fate, every detail was carried back to Cromwell. Anne would pace the rooms, sometimes laughing, sometimes collapsing into uncontrollable sobbing. At one point, she begged to be examined by physicians to prove she was innocent of the adultery charges. Imagine the humiliation, pleading for her body to be inspected like a criminal specimen, simply to prove her fidelity. But the most insidious cruelty was the manipulation of hope. Her execution date was set for May 18th. She spent the entire night of the 17th praying, preparing to die. At dawn, the guards told her the execution was delayed. No reason. No explanation. just another day of torment. Kingston wrote that Anne grew very desirous to be executed. In other words, she begged for death. They had broken her so completely that the axe, or in her case the sword, became a mercy she craved. And all the while, Anne asked after her brother George. She couldn't believe he too was imprisoned. She asked after her father, Thomas Boleyn, still a powerful man at court. But her father had abandoned her, sacrificing his daughter to protect his own survival. Her family's silence was the loudest betrayal of all. In those days, Anne wasn't being killed by sword or judgment. She was being killed by silence, by time, by the unbearable weight of knowing she was utterly alone. By May 15, 1536, Anne Boleyn was no longer a queen awaiting justice. She was a condemned woman walking into theater, a trial where the script had already been written. The courtroom was crowded with 2,000 people, but not a single voice there was hers. The jury. Hand-picked enemies. 27 peers of the realm, each one sworn to Henry's will. Presiding was Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, a man willing to destroy his niece if it meant preserving his favor at court. When the moment came, it would be his lips that declared her death sentence. Imagine hearing your uncle pronounce your execution. The prosecution brought no living witnesses, no physical evidence, only tortured confessions and fabricated timelines, and wasn't even told the details of the charges until she stood before her accusers. She had no lawyer, no counsel, no chance to summon witnesses in her defense. This wasn't justice, it was ritual sacrifice dressed up in law. But here's the part that reveals Henry's cruelty more than anything. On the very morning of the trial, before Anne had even spoken a word, Henry promised Jane Seymour, the woman he was already courting, that his queen would be condemned before the day was out. In other words, the verdict wasn't decided by evidence. It was decided in a lover's embrace. And, to her credit, defended herself with composure that astonished witnesses. She denied each charge, standing proud, refusing to crumble before the jeering court. Yet every argument, every plea, fell into silence. When Norfolk finally asked for the verdict, all 27 jurors answered in unison, guilty. Not one dissenter. Not one whisper of doubt. But Henry wasn't finished. He turned even her death into a weapon of humiliation. Traditionally, queens guilty of treason were burned alive. But Henry, in what he called an act of mercy, commuted her sentence to beheading. And then came the twist. He ordered a specialist swordsman from Calais, France. This wasn't kindness. It was spectacle. By choosing a Frenchman, Henry signaled to the world that Anne was beyond English justice, beyond redemption, beyond even the customs of her own country. He reduced her final moments to a foreign performance, dragging out the weight as she lingered in limbo for the swordsman's arrival. Every delay tightened the screws of psychological torture. Every postponement reminded, and she was powerless even over the hour of her death. The queen who once stood at the center of power was now an actor trapped in someone else's play, forced to await the final scene. And that scene, her execution, would not just kill a queen. It would etch terror into England's soul, and scar her daughter for life. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn stepped onto Tower Green transformed. The woman who once dazzled Henry with wit and fire now appeared almost spectral, dressed in a simple gray damask gown, her dark hair hidden beneath a cap, her face pale yet composed. She no longer looked like a queen fighting for life. She looked like someone who had already crossed into acceptance. The scaffold was surrounded by nobles, guards, and a hushed crowd. Everyone expected fear, but what they saw unsettled them even more. Anne spoke calmly, praising Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord, and asking the people to pray for him. Was it sarcasm sharpened into steel? Or was it a desperate plea to shield her daughter, Elizabeth, from future wrath? Historians still argue. What is certain is that her words left the air trembling. Then came the moment that chills the soul. Turning to her ladies, Anne touched her slender neck and said with a faint laugh, "I hear the executioner is very good, and I have a little neck." That wasn't gallows humor. That was a woman so broken by weeks of torment that she mocked her own beheading as though it were theater. The French swordsman stepped forward, his blade hidden in the straw, and knelt upright, the French style, no block, no blindfold, her eyes scanning the crowd for the last sight she'd ever see. While his assistant created a distraction, the executioner struck one clean blow. Her head fell, and witnesses swore her lips kept moving in silent prayer for several moments after death. Whether muscle spasms or some flicker of consciousness, the image seared itself into memory. And then, perhaps the cruelest insult of all. No coffin had been prepared. Her ladies, sobbing, wrapped her body in white cloth and placed her remains in an old arrow chest from the Tower Armory. The first Queen of England ever executed was buried like contraband, dumped in an unmarked grave inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. No funeral, no prayers, no dignity. But Anne's death did not end on that scaffold. It lived on in the eyes of her 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. As a child, Elizabeth whispered that she would never marry after watching another of her father's queens, Catherine Howard, share her mother's fate. She kept that vow until her death, becoming the Virgin Queen. She carried a secret ring with portraits of herself and an hidden inside, worn every day of her life. Behind the crown, behind the legend, was a daughter haunted by a mother's ghost. Anne Boleyn's death shattered England's trust in justice. It showed that law could be twisted, juries packed, verdicts scripted. And it left a scar so deep that even centuries later, the Tower of London is less a monument than a graveyard of broken truth. Because in May of 1536, England didn't just kill a queen. It killed justice itself.